Hey, Soul Stories fam, we're starting a new love journey. Tell us where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe and join our family. Now stay with us. The story begins. The car had been parked there for a long time. So long that the last remaining warmth from the day had completely faded, leaving the cold to creep through the metal frame, seep into the seats, and slowly sink into the body of the woman curled up in the back seat, as if the car itself had forgotten it was ever meant to carry someone home. Emily Carter lay on her side, knees pulled tight to her chest, arms wrapped around herself in a posture that was both defensive and desperate. Her coat was drawn all the way up to her chin, even though she knew it offered little protection against the cold that was steadily growing heavier. Her breath fogged the window, forming a fragile haze that quickly disappeared, only to return again and again. Silent proof that she was still here, even though she wished she weren't. She breathed very lightly, not because she was afraid of the cold, but because she was afraid of being seen. Emily shifted slightly, turning her face toward the inside of the car, so that if anyone happened to pass through this nearly empty parking lot, they would see only a dim patch of darkness behind the glass. Not the exhausted face of a woman who didn't know where she belonged tonight. Her hair fell forward, covering most of her face. Her cheek pressed against the icy seat, which carried the stale scent of old upholstery and something harder to name. The smell of abandonment, of things that were once cared for and then forgotten. Emily closed her eyes, not to sleep, just to avoid facing herself. And the yellow lights of the parking lot filtered through the windshield in flickering, uneven streaks, making the inside of the car feel weary and unfamiliar, like a distorted reflection of a life that had quietly slipped out of its proper order. Somewhere far away, a car door slammed shut. A shopping cart rolled lightly across the concrete and then stopped. After that, everything fell silent. That silence made Emily's chest tighten, because when there were no other sounds, her thoughts began to creep in. Not loud, not dramatic, but relentless and cruel. Emily didn't allow herself to think too far ahead. She didn't think about tomorrow. She didn't think about how everything had ended up like this. Instead, she focused on very specific, very small sensations. The seatbelt buckle digging into her hip, the dull ache in her neck from lying at the wrong angle, the deep exhaustion of a body that had been holding on for far too long without ever truly stopping. She told herself this was only temporary, just one night, just until morning. Emily turned her face closer to the door, lifting her sleeve to cover her mouth when her chest suddenly tightened. She swallowed every sound before it could escape, because the thought of someone hearing her, recognizing her, knowing she was here like this, made her feel unbearably exposed. Having no money was painful enough, but being seen like this, that was a humiliation Emily wasn't sure she could endure. She pulled her coat tighter once more, as if the thin fabric could conceal not only her body, but the version of herself she no longer recognized. The woman who had drifted here, silent and invisible, unknown to anyone, unnoticed, unclaimed. Emily's phone lay face down beside her, the screen completely dark. No notifications, no missed calls. She didn't touch it, because the most painful part wasn't that no one was looking for her. It was that she no longer had the strength to hope they would. If no one saw Emily Carter tonight, then no one would have to witness the humiliating truth that, just for tonight, only tonight, she had nowhere to call home. Her eyelids fluttered as exhaustion finally began to overpower fear, pulling her slowly into a suspended space between waking and sleep, where the pain dulled just enough to be bearable, if only for a moment. And then, knock! The sound struck the window, sharp and close. So close it felt as if someone had tapped directly against her chest. Her eyes flew open, her breath caught in her throat. Her entire body went rigid, her heart pounding so violently she was almost certain that if the silence lasted one more second, it would be audible. Emily didn't move, didn't sit up, didn't dare to breathe. There was only one thought left in her mind, sharp and painfully clear. Please don't see me. She stared at the inside of the car door, her pulse roaring in her ears. Shame surged up alongside fear, because whoever was standing outside, whatever they were, they would understand how far she had fallen. understand that her life now existed only within this cramped space. Emily squeezed her eyes shut, as if keeping them closed could make this moment disappear. Knock, knock. Emily Carter once had a place in this world. Not the loud kind, not the kind of fame that made people look up the moment she walked into a room, but a quiet certainty, the grounded sense of someone who knew she was living her own life, who woke up each morning with a clear reason to get out of bed. Emily had a job. Not just a job to pay the bills, but a career she had spent years building. A place where her voice carried weight, where her opinions were taken seriously instead of brushed aside like passing remarks. Emily's workdays began with packed meeting schedules, early emails awaiting her response, and the familiar feeling of stepping into a glass high-rise, knowing that somewhere in those bright, polished rooms, decisions were waiting for her to make. She moved swiftly through the office hallways, heels tapping lightly against the stone floor, her posture straight, her gaze focused. Not because she was trying to appear strong, but because she genuinely was. Emily had business cards in her purse, a distinct signature under every email, colleagues who came to her for counsel, and more than once, an entire room fell silent, waiting for her to speak before any plan could be finalized. Her validation didn't come from public praise, but from the smallest details. A confident nod, an exchanged glance, her name listed among those responsible for a major project. She was not someone's wife. She was not the shadow behind someone else's spotlight. Emily Carter was herself. On certain evenings, when she left the office late and the city lights reflected off towering glass buildings, her shadow stretched long across the pavement. In those fleeting moments among the bustling crowds, Emily felt something simple yet priceless. She belonged here. She had the right to be tired. She had the right to doubt herself on difficult days. But she never once doubted her own worth. When people asked what she did, her answer was always crisp, clear, with no apology, no need to soften the truth. And in the way she spoke about her work, there was a quiet confidence. The kind that exists only in someone who knows her life doesn't depend on anyone's permission to be lived. More importantly, Emily never saw herself as weak, because at that time, no matter how much life made her stumble, it had never made her disappear. And perhaps it was because she had once lived so fully in her own skin that when everything later collapsed, the pain wasn't just about what she lost, but about being pushed out of the life that had once been undeniably hers. Emily Carter didn't get married because she needed someone to lean on. She entered marriage with the confidence of someone who had once stood firmly on her own 2 feet, believing that love was a partnership, two people walking side by side, each carrying their own life, yet choosing to look in the same direction. At the time, Emily didn't think she was giving anything up. She only thought she was expanding her life to make room for someone else. At first, everything seemed perfectly reasonable. Her husband's work schedule grew increasingly demanding. Late-night calls, business trips that stretched longer and longer. The house needed someone to keep things running. Dinner needed someone to be there on time. And then that sentence appeared, softly, almost harmlessly, spoken on an ordinary evening like any other. Just for now? Emily remembered that moment clearly, the way she nodded without hesitation, the way she told herself that a short pause couldn't possibly erase everything she had spent years building. She believed she was capable of returning at any time. She believed in the stability of marriage. She believed the promise that, when the time was right, everything would return to where it belonged. And so, Emily quit her job. At first, it didn't feel like a fall, more like a calculated step back. She reorganized her time, adjusted to a new rhythm of life, and learned how to stand behind someone else's success without feeling bitter. She took care of the house, attended to every small detail, telling herself that this too was a form of contribution, just one that was less visible. She started missing work emails, then meeting invitations. Then there are even the casual check-in calls from former colleagues. At first, she responded to all of them, then less and less. And then there were names that no longer appeared on her phone screen at all. Emily didn't realize how quickly the change had happened. Not until one day, when she happened to open her old laptop and look at her resume again, did she freeze. The gap stood out too clearly, not because of missing words, but because of missing time. A silence far longer than she had imagined. She began hearing familiar phrases more often. It's convenient for you to stay home anyway. I'm really busy right now. You understand? They weren't cruel words. They weren't raised voices. But day after day, they were enough to push Emily a little farther away from her former self without her even noticing. Then the breaking point arrived. Not as a sudden explosion, but as a lingering exhaustion. Conversations grew shorter. Silences lasted longer. A distance formed between two people who had once believed that love alone would be enough. When the marriage finally cracked, Emily was the last to realize it. She had grown so accustomed to stepping aside that when she tried to return to the center of her own life, she discovered it had been empty for some time. The divorce wasn't dramatic. There were no explosive arguments, no harsh accusations, just a quiet withdrawal, as though both of them were too tired to hold on to something that no longer resembled what it once was. After the paperwork was finalized, Emily stood alone in the empty house, looking around at the walls she had once believed were a home. And for the first time in her life, she had no idea where to begin again. She looked for work. Or rather, she tried. Emails went unanswered. Interviews ended with polite but distant nods. Questions about the gap in her career were asked gently, yet accompanied by appraising glances. "What have you been doing the past few years?" Emily answered honestly, and every time she felt herself shrink just a little more. Her savings dwindled. Bills piled up. The apartment grew quieter than ever, as if even the space itself was slowly retreating from her life. Some mornings Emily woke up and needed a few seconds to remember who she was. Not from amnesia, but because there was no clear role left for her to hold on to. She was no longer the woman in the conference room. No longer a wife. No one needs anyone else anymore. And the most shameful part for Emily wasn't losing everything. It was the feeling that she had placed herself here with her own hands, through choices once called love, once called sacrifice, once promised to be temporary. She began avoiding familiar faces, avoiding casual questions. She avoided even looking at herself in the mirror. Because the woman reflected there was someone she didn't recognize, not because she was weak, but because she was hollow. Emily Carter didn't just lose her job. She lost her money. She lost her place in the world. And worst of all, she lost the sense that she had ever been someone with a name. After the second knock, the parking lot fell silent again. Not the kind of silence that brings relief, but the kind that stretches a person's heartbeat to the point of pain, as if one more sound would snap the fragile threads holding everything together. Emily Carter did not move. Her whole body remained frozen in the back seat, her spine pressed against the cold upholstery, her heart pounding so hard that each beat echoed in her ears. She didn't open her eyes. She didn't dare. Because if she did, she would have to face the truth that someone was out there. And that person knew she was here. Knew she hadn't gone home. Knew she was sleeping in her car. The very thought made Emily's throat tighten. Shame rose faster than fear, so overwhelming that she clapped a hand over her mouth as if she could hold back the sound of her trembling breath. Outside, the man didn't knock again. Daniel Reeves stood at a respectful distance from the car door, arms resting by his sides, body perfectly still. Not because he was unsure, but because he knew exactly what kind of feeling lived behind that layer of glass. He had seen it in himself once, the desire to disappear, to let the world pass by without noticing your existence, to hide in a confined space, just big enough to avoid questions, avoid eyes, avoid life. Daniel inhaled slowly, then spoke, not louder than necessary, not stepping any closer, each word chosen carefully, as though one wrong move might shatter something unbearably fragile. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low, calm, unhurried. "I didn't mean to scare you." He paused, no further questions, no long explanations, just enough for the person inside the car to know he had noticed the silence and was respecting it. Emily swallowed hard. Part of her wanted to curl up and pretend she hadn't heard anything, pretend no one was out there, pretend this humiliating moment didn't exist. But another part, the worn-out, exhausted, brutally honest part, was too tired to hide anymore. She opened her eyes. Through the fog glass, she saw a silhouette standing back, not pressing against the door, not trying to peer inside. Tall but not imposing, simply waiting. Her heart eased just slightly. With shaking fingers, Emily lowered the window a small crack. Not to invite him in, just to listen. Immediately, Daniel stepped back another pace. "I've been working nights lately," he said, voice still low and steady. "Saw this car parked here for a long time. Just wanted to make sure you were okay." He didn't ask why she was here, didn't ask if she needed help, didn't stare at her longer than necessary. Emily inhaled sharply. The cold air burned her lungs, but it also cleared her mind. I, I'm fine," she said, her voice hoarse from having gone unused for too long. Daniel nodded once, lightly, as if accepting her answer without challenge. "All right," he said. "If I bothered you, I apologize." He turned to leave. And at that moment, the moment he chose to retreat instead of push, something inside Emily trembled. She didn't know what it was. She only knew that if he walked away now, the parking lot would slip back into its old silence, and she would curl up in that car again, wrapped in a shame she had never admitted, at least not to another soul. "Wait." Her voice was so soft she almost didn't hear it herself. Daniel stopped instantly. He turned but kept his distance. His eyes held no demand, no intrusion. Emily opened the car door. The metallic click cut through the night, sharp enough that both of them froze for the briefest second. The moment a small decision was made, one that could no longer be taken back. Emily stepped out of the car. Her feet touched the cold concrete, a sensation so real, so grounding, it struck her how long it had been since she truly stood on her own 2 feet. Not physically, something deeper. Daniel didn't move toward her. He simply waited. "There's a gas station up ahead," he said after a moment. "I just made some coffee. If you want, you can sit for a bit." Not a gesture dripping with sympathy, just a door left slightly open, wide enough for her to choose. She looked at the paper cup in his hand, steam rising faintly into the cold air, and realized how long it had been since someone offered her something without judgment or expectation. Emily nodded. They sat on the concrete ledge nearby, a short distance from the car, far enough that this moment wasn't defined by the image of her sleeping in it, close enough that she could still return if she needed to. 2 paper cups between them. Warmth slowly seeped into Emily's frozen hands. No rushed words, no questions. Just 2 people sitting together in the late night, each carrying a life that had veered off course in its own way, and for the first time in a very long time, no longer entirely running from it. Daniel Reeves sat still, both hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that had gone more than half cold. His gaze wasn't on Emily Carter, but fixed on the darkness ahead, where the yellow lights of the parking lot weren't bright enough to illuminate anything clearly, as if he were accustomed to existing on the margins of every space, close enough to be present, far enough to go unnoticed. At closer range, Emily realized that Daniel Reeves carried a very particular kind of silence. Not the silence of someone with nothing to say, but the silence of someone who had said too much in his life and had chosen to keep the most important things to himself. He looked so ordinary he was almost forgettable. A dark jacket, worn jeans, shoes scuffed at the heels from long shifts. There was nothing about him that suggested familiarity with major decisions or with the weight of other people's expectations. And clearly, he had intended to keep it that way. Daniel Reeves had once lived a different life. No one here knew that. No one needed to. His present life had been carefully constructed to provoke no questions. He worked nights, ate simply, came and went on time. He didn't talk about the past, didn't keep objects that might remind him of who he used to be. He had dismantled every piece of his former self with his own hands, titles, authority, presence, in exchange for a life that was quiet enough, closed enough, empty enough that no one expected anything of him anymore. Because Daniel Reeves understood one thing very clearly. He had once put work above people, and he had paid the price for it. His punishment wasn't loud. It didn't come in the form of a scandal or public collapse. It lived in the choice to remain anonymous, in the decision to stay out of the light even though he easily could have stepped into it, in the act of turning himself into someone the world passed by without stopping. Across from him, Emily Carter tightened her grip on the coffee cup in her hands. The warmth had steadied her trembling fingers, but it couldn't soothe the tightness rising in her throat. There was something about this man's silence that made her feel unpressured. He wasn't looking at her as if waiting for an explanation. He carried no curiosity, no pity. He was simply there, solid, still, as if whatever she said wouldn't be discarded. Emily took a deep breath. I used to... She stopped, her breath catching midway, as if she had to search for a very old word. I used to have a completely different life. Daniel didn't turn to her right away. He only tilted his head slightly. A very small gesture, just enough to let her know he was listening, that she wasn't speaking into emptiness. Emily told him. She didn't speak quickly, and not with the polish she once had in boardroom presentations. Her voice slowed at times, stumbled at others, but it didn't break. She told him about her former job, about busy days filled with purpose, about the feeling of having her voice carry weight, of being seen as someone capable, not a supporting role in someone else's life. She told him how she had believed she could balance everything, that loving someone didn't mean disappearing, that just for now really would only be temporary. I quit my job to take care of my family, Emily said, her eyes fixed on the ground. At the time, I thought I was choosing love, not giving something up. Daniel tightened his grip on his own cup, but didn't interrupt. Emily went on, about the gaps slowly forming in her resume, about phone calls becoming fewer and farther between, about the vague, unsettling feeling of no longer being needed, of having only one remaining role, keeping everything around her from falling apart. She talked about the divorce, not explosive, not tragic, just two exhausted people letting go when they realized they hadn't been standing in the same world for a very long time. After that, I couldn't find a job, she said softly, as if lowering her voice might make the truth lighter. I sent out so many applications, went to interviews, and every time they asked what I'd done during those years, Emily let out a small laugh, but there was no joy in it. I felt myself disappear a little more. Daniel looked at her for the first time, not intently, not analytically, just enough for her to know that he understood. Emily lowered her head, gently turning the coffee cup in her hands. There are days when I don't know who I am anymore, she said, not because I'm weak, but because there's no place left for me to stand. Her voice wavered on the last sentence. Daniel didn't speak right away. He had heard many stories in his life, but some stories didn't need advice or solutions. They only needed to be set down in front of another person, so they would no longer remain alone inside someone's chest. You're not invisible, he said after a long while, his voice low and steady. You've just been pushed out of the place you once belonged. Emily closed her eyes. Not because it hurt, but because for the first time in a very long time, someone had named her feeling exactly as it was. Daniel Reeves sat there deep in the night, with his old life left unmentioned, with truths he wasn't ready to confess. But as he looked at the woman in front of him, he knew one thing very clearly. She didn't need to be saved. She needed to be seen. And in that moment, he had no idea that by letting her speak everything aloud, he himself was beginning to step out of the silence he had imprisoned himself in for far too long. Daniel Reeves didn't say grand words that night. After Emily Carter finished speaking, after her final sentences fell like tiny shards of glass, he didn't rush to reassure her, nor did he offer the kind of hollow advice people give when they don't know how to sit with someone else's pain. He simply sat there for a long while until the silence between them was no longer heavy, but became a space safe enough for both of them to breathe. Then Daniel stood up, not abruptly, not in a way that startled her. He rose as if he had spent enough time thinking to ensure what he was about to do wasn't impulsive, wasn't an intrusion that would make her feel pitied. There's a place nearby you can stay, he said, his voice low and steady, as if mentioning something utterly ordinary. Nothing fancy, but quiet. He didn't look directly at her as he said it, didn't look to gauge her reaction, didn't look to persuade her. He just spoke and left the choice there. Emily slowly stood as well. Her legs tingled from sitting too long, and in that moment of putting her weight onto her feet, she realized how long it had been since she actually felt steady. Not because she was tired, but because she had grown accustomed to always being ready to retreat. Daniel walked half a step ahead, not far enough that she had to hurry, not close enough to make her feel led. The small room he brought her to was in an old roadside motel. Warm yellow hallway lights, carpet worn at the edges, the faint scent of cheap but clean soap. When Daniel opened the door, Emily glanced around quickly, as if searching for some sign that this was a transaction with strings attached. There was nothing, just a bed, a small bathroom, and a quietness she hadn't had for many nights. "Lock the door," Daniel said, placing the key on the little wooden table near the entrance. "Just get some sleep." "No, I'll wait." "No, you owe me." He lingered at the threshold for one brief second and then left. That night, Emily had her first hot meal in days. Not a feast, just a simple takeout box. Rice, a steaming stew, flavors unremarkable, yet warm enough to remind her body what nourishment felt like. She ate slowly, not because she wasn't hungry, but because something about the moment frightened her. Frightened her that if she ate too quickly, if she savored too much, she would understand how deprived she had been. The next morning, Daniel didn't ask if she had slept well. He just left a hot cup of coffee and a small bag of bread outside her door, as if to say that sometimes the most necessary things in life aren't spoken. They're prepared for you before you even step outside. They sat at the motel's outdoor table, the morning sun soft enough to make everything look less harsh. Daniel drank his coffee and let Emily speak if she wished. And when she didn't, he didn't fill the silence. "What kind of work did you used to do?" he asked eventually, not out of curiosity but respect. Emily answered, not with the pride she once had, but no longer with the shame she carried. Daniel listened carefully as though every detail mattered, not to figure out who she was now, but to remember who she had once been. "That experience didn't disappear," he said quietly. "It just got forgotten." He didn't talk about money, didn't say he could handle things. Instead, Daniel asked practical questions about her skills, the tasks she excelled at, the parts of her work that once made her feel alive rather than merely functioning. He offered to help update her resume, not as someone granting a favor, but as someone sitting beside her, reminding her she once had substance. They sat in the motel's public computer area. Daniel didn't type for her. He simply sat next to her, occasionally asking short questions or restating an accomplishment she had mentioned, as though it was obvious, as though it was something she deserved to claim, gently but firmly brushing dust off pieces of her identity. "Write this part more clearly," he said. "You did that really well. Not you should, but you did." And little by little, in those small details, a line in the resume, a carefully rewritten email, a planned phone call, Emily felt something shift. Daniel didn't drag her out of the bottom in one dramatic pull. He laid out steps. Each one is low enough not to overwhelm. Each one was solid enough for her to climb herself. And that, being given back the right to stand on her own, was what made Emily Carter begin to believe that maybe her life hadn't ended in that cold parking lot. Daniel Reeves had no idea that while he was helping her gather the scattered pieces of who she was, something buried deep within him was awakening too. A part of a man who had spent far too long giving without ever allowing himself to exist. But that was a story for later. For now, he did just one thing. He pulled her out of the depths. Not with money, not with power, but with the quiet presence of someone who didn't walk away. Emily Carter sent out her resumes on a perfectly ordinary morning, not in a panic and not with the same desperation as before. She sat at the small table by the motel window, pale sunlight falling across her laptop screen, reread each email one last time, then clicked send, slowly and carefully, as if every click weren't just another application sent off, but a thin thread tying her back to the life she was trying to return to. She didn't sit there waiting for replies afterward. Emily stood up, changed clothes, tied her hair back neatly, and prepared for a day that was very different from the aimless ones she'd been drifting through before. At Daniel's suggestion, the gas station where he worked the night shift needed someone to help during the day. It wasn't a prestigious position. It wasn't a job she'd be proud to talk about. It was simply a job, real enough to begin again. Emily remembered clearly the moment Daniel mentioned it to her, without pity, without the tone of someone doing her a favor. "You could try," he said simply, "just to get your rhythm back first." And so Emily tried. On her first morning at the gas station, Emily stood behind the counter in a plain apron, the smell of brewed coffee mingling with gasoline in the air. Strange, but not as unpleasant as she'd imagined. She learned how to operate the register, how to greet customers at the right moment, and how to smile naturally rather than as a defensive reflex. The work was repetitive and undemanding, but that was exactly what allowed Emily to breathe. She had some time to arrive, a time to leave, a clock to look at. Each completed transaction was a finished action. Nothing left hanging, nothing abandoned midway, unlike the life she'd been living these past months. Sometimes in the middle of her shift, Emily would see Daniel leaving the gas station after his night shift. He didn't stop. He just nodded as he passed by. A small gesture, but enough to let her know he was leaving space for her to stand on her own, not as someone being helped, but as a coworker. When evening came, Emily took off her apron and stepped away from the counter, fatigue spreading through her body. But it was a different kind of tired. Tired from working, tired from being present, and because of that, she slept better than she had in a long time. That night, after resting for a bit, Emily returned to the gas station, not to work, but to bring Daniel a cup of hot coffee. She set the cup on the counter while the station was quiet, then sat down in the familiar plastic chair outside. Daniel came out a few minutes later, picked up the coffee, surprise flickering briefly in his eyes before softening, as if he wasn't used to being thought of after hours. They sat side by side. They didn't talk about big things. Emily told him about the daytime customers, the hurried man who spilled his coffee, the elderly woman who talked endlessly about nothing in particular, the teenager who bought candy and counted out coins one by one. Daniel chuckled softly. He shared a few small stories from the night shift. A truck stopping by at 3 in the morning, a customer who stood still for a long time and then left, the stretches of silence when the whole road seemed to sleep. Mundane, scattered stories, not meant to be remembered. Yet it was through those stories that Emily realized something important. Life doesn't always have to carry great meaning. Sometimes continuing is enough. A few days later, while Emily was organizing shelves in the small storage room behind the gas station, her phone vibrated in her pocket. She looked at the screen, her heart slowing for a second. An email address she recognized, one she'd sent her resume to. Emily didn't open it right away. She took a deep breath, wiped her hands on her apron, and only then opened the email. The position they were offering wasn't big. It was just a trial role, part-time in her former field. No authority, no glamour, but enough to prove that she still had a place somewhere beyond this cashier counter. Emily stood there for a long time. She didn't cry, she didn't cheer. She simply felt something very clear rise in her chest. Hope, quiet and unhurried, but steady enough to make her believe she was moving in the right direction. That night, she brought the news to the gas station. She didn't say it right away. She sat down beside Daniel, handed him his usual cup of coffee, then spoke softly, as if afraid of disturbing something fragile. "A company just got back to me." Daniel looked at her. This time he didn't hide his smile. Not the smile of someone who'd expected the outcome, but the smile of someone who understood that even the smallest effort, sooner or later, finds a place to be heard. Emily Carter sat there beneath the familiar yellow lights of the gas station, hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee, and for the first time in a long while, she no longer felt like she was borrowing someone else's life. She was rebuilding her own, one shift at a time, one email sent. One day she didn't give up. The new job was nothing like the smooth return Emily Carter had hoped for in those first days. The position she was given was small, barely more than a trial, a test to see whether she was still fit for professional work. And in those early weeks, Emily often came back to her room with her mind stretched tight, shoulders aching, familiar terms suddenly slippery, and new procedures forcing her to move one beat slower than everyone else. Some evenings, as she opened her laptop to review the day's tasks, Emily felt the old fear lurking again. The fear that she had drifted too far from the person she once was, that the gap in her resume wasn't just a number, but a real fracture, something that couldn't be repaired. But the days kept passing. Emily slowly found her rhythm, not loudly, Not suddenly. Just one morning she realized she no longer needed to write everything down. One afternoon, a coworker turned to her for an opinion instead of just passing along assigned tasks. One email was answered with trust. One tiny bullet point had her name added to it. And then one day her manager called her in. No speech, just a simple sentence. "We want to bring you on permanently." Emily sat still for a few seconds, letting the words seep into her like a slow warmth. Then they gave her a small project. Only a section of work. Nothing big, nothing glamorous, but it was hers. That afternoon, sitting at her desk and looking at documents with her name on them, Emily realized a familiar sensation had returned. The feeling of being trusted, of being responsible, of existing in a tangible way. The work began to pull her forward, not in the way that once drained her to exhaustion, but in a way that made time move faster, cleaner, more defined. Emily no longer counted days the way she once did. Sleeping in her car, she started planning weeks, months, next steps. Cautiously, yes, but genuinely. Only one thing didn't change. Every evening after work, Emily still stopped by the gas station. Even when she was late, even when she was tired. No matter what the day held. She brought a quick dinner or just a hot cup of coffee picked up on the way and sat in the familiar seat by the door where Daniel Reeves usually ended his night shift. They still sat there, talking about nothing and everything. Emily shared fragments of her new project, not bragging, just speaking. She mentioned a difficult coworker, an unnecessarily long meeting, and the odd feeling of seeing her name written on an internal document for the first time. Daniel listened. He stayed the same as always, leaning back slightly, hands wrapped around his coffee cup, eyes calm but never absent. He shared tiny stories about quiet shifts, a car that stopped and left, and how the air grew colder right before dawn. And gradually, Emily noticed something she had never paid attention to before. Daniel Reeves never talked about himself. He talked about the weather, about passing customers, about anything that wasn't him. He always hovered at the edge of the story, as if taking one step closer would expose something, not to others but to himself. Emily watched him more closely and suddenly she understood. Daniel Reeves was running too. That night they sat in silence longer than usual. Emily stirred her coffee, the spoon tapping lightly against the cup, then looked up at him. Daniel was staring toward the dark road in front of the station, where the lights stretched into blurred streaks. His face carried a weariness she rarely saw in daylight. Not the tiredness of lack of sleep, but the exhaustion of holding on to something heavy for too long. "Daniel," Emily said softly, not to interrupt, but as if asking permission to enter a private space inside him. He turned to her. "Why are you really here?" The question wasn't sharp. It wasn't probing. It was human. Daniel froze. The moment stretched so long, Emily could hear the hum of the gas station's air conditioning, the faint sound of a car passing somewhere down the quiet road. No one had ever asked him that, not like this. People had asked Daniel about work, about success, about what he had built. But no one had ever asked about him, about the man who chose night shifts, who stood here in the quiet hours, away from a life he could have stepped into without trouble. Daniel Reeves lowered his gaze. His coffee had gone cold without him noticing. And for the first time in a very long time, he realized there was a question he couldn't outrun, because the person asking wasn't searching for the perfect answer. She was simply trying to see him, the same way he had once seen her. Daniel Reeves didn't answer right away after Emily's question. He remained seated on the familiar plastic chair outside the gas station, both hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, his gaze fixed on the darkness ahead, as if, by staring long enough, he might slip back into it once more. But this time silence was no longer a safe refuge, because the woman sitting beside him didn't look away, didn't pretend the question had never been asked. Emily waited patiently. She didn't press him. She didn't apologize for asking. Daniel took a deep breath, the kind of breath taken by someone long accustomed to controlling his emotions, yet no longer strong enough to keep them in place. "I used to have a very different life," he finally said, his voice lowering, slow and deliberate, as if he were opening a door that had been locked for far too long. He didn't begin with the name of a company. He didn't begin with achievements. He began with the woman who had once been the center of his world. Daniel said that back then, he lived caught in the cycle of work, projects larger than time itself, ambitions he believed he was pursuing for both of them. He believed that if he just pushed a little harder, succeeded one step further, everything would be fine. That love was strong enough to wait, patient enough not to demand his presence at the right moments. I always told her, just a little more time, Daniel said, the corner of his mouth lifting into a smile that held no trace of joy. Just for now. Emily tightened her hand slightly in her lap. She recognized that phrase, not logically, but through the memory of her own life. Daniel spoke of nights when he came home very late, the house already dark, and he thought it was nothing more than ordinary exhaustion. Of messages he left unanswered until morning. Of trips he believed were necessary, impossible to refuse. I always thought I had time, he said quietly. But there are things that don't wait. His voice faltered on the last words. Daniel lowered his head, his shoulders taut, as if loosening his grip even slightly would cause everything he had held back to spill out uncontrollably. He spoke of the accident, not in detail. There was no need. Only that it had been an ordinary evening, a call he hadn't answered in time, a moment when he chose to stay a few minutes longer for work instead of going home sooner. And then everything ended before he had a chance to turn back. She died, Daniel said, his voice breaking just slightly, but enough for Emily to hear. And in my mind, there isn't a single day I don't think that if I'd gone home earlier that night, if I hadn't put work before a person, then maybe. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. That guilt, Emily knew it too well. I lost her because of myself, Daniel continued. Because of me. Because of my choices. Because of my ambition. He looked at Emily for the first time during the story. His eyes weren't asking for forgiveness. They were looking for a verdict. I thought I didn't deserve my old life anymore, Daniel said. Didn't deserve the lights. Didn't deserve happiness. So I disappeared, stayed here, worked night shifts, lived quietly enough that no one needed anything from me. Emily listened to the entire story without interrupting. She didn't see a weak man before her. She saw someone who had sentenced himself for far too long. When Daniel fell silent, as if he had said everything he allowed himself to say, Emily took a deep breath, not to prepare an argument, but to make sure the words she was about to speak came from the deepest place in her heart. Daniel, she said his name, very slowly, very clearly. He looked up. You're not a villain, Emily said. Her voice wasn't raised. She didn't argue. It was simply a truth spoken with the certainty of someone who had also blamed herself for what she had lost. You loved her, Emily continued, and you made mistakes. But making mistakes doesn't mean you have to disappear from your own life. Daniel shook his head slightly. You don't understand. I do understand, Emily cut in, her voice firmer this time. I understand the feeling that if you suffer long enough, that will somehow make things right. But that isn't fair. Not to her, and not to you. She leaned slightly toward him, close enough that he couldn't avoid her gaze, but without touching him, because she knew some words needed distance to carry their weight. You don't have to disappear to pay for what you lost. The words fell between them, simple yet heavy. Daniel closed his eyes. In that moment, all the years of self-punishment, the night shifts, the choice to live beneath his potential, the days he refused himself any joy, suddenly became painfully clear. Emily didn't tell him he had to return immediately. She didn't tell him he had to forgive himself right away. She said only the most important thing, you have the right to keep living. Daniel opened his eyes. His chest rose and fell, his breath faltering for a beat, as if for the first time in a very long while. Not from pain, but because something inside him was struggling to rise. He looked at the woman sitting beside him, the woman who had once slept in her car, who had once been invisible, who had once stood on the edge of collapse, and realized that she, by standing up again through small, steady steps, had pulled him back from the darkness he had locked himself inside. Emily Carter didn't save him with promises. She saved him by not walking away when he spoke the ugliest truth about himself. And that night, Beneath the cold yellow lights of the gas station, Daniel Reeves didn't feel the need to run anymore, for the first time in many years. After the night Daniel Reeves finally spoke the truths he had buried in his chest for years, nothing in their lives changed dramatically. There were no grand promises, no sudden decisions to turn their worlds around, only a quiet presence, but steadier than before. Daniel still worked the night shift. Emily was still busy with her new job, with the first small project that carried her name. They still sat outside the gas station every evening. Still the same old plastic chairs, still hot coffee, still conversations without beginnings or endings. But something had shifted. The silence between them was no longer distance. It became a refuge, a place where no one had to pretend they were fine before they truly were, a place where no one was forced to become a healed version of themselves just to be allowed to stay. Daniel no longer remained on the sidelines. He no longer stood outside Emily's stories. He asked about her project, not out of polite curiosity, but like someone who genuinely wanted to know how her day had gone. He listened to the small details, a difficult email, a delayed decision, a moment of self-doubt, and never rushed to offer advice. He simply said, "I'm here." Emily didn't try to make him laugh. She didn't talk just to fill space, nor did she joke to cover the moments when Daniel suddenly went quiet. When he drifted into silence, she didn't push. When he avoided her eyes, she didn't pull him back. She understood that healing doesn't come through force. Some nights, Daniel grew distant, his gaze fixed too long on the empty road in front of the gas station, as if the past could return at any second and drag him out of the present. Emily would quietly move her chair a little closer, not touching him, not interfering, just close enough that he knew he wasn't drifting alone. And on some evenings, Emily was so tired she could barely speak. Daniel let that be enough. He brought her another cup of water, laid his jacket across the back of her chair when the night wind grew cold. Small actions, not labeled as love, never named, yet accumulating into something steady and real. They began to understand each other's rhythms. They knew when Emily needed to talk. They knew when Daniel needed silence. And in that wordless understanding, something tender crept in. Not a stormy rush, but like warm water seeping slowly through the cracks of two lives once shattered. One night, Emily found herself telling Daniel something deeply personal, her fear that if she ever succeeded again, she would lose something precious in the process. Daniel didn't laugh, didn't dismiss it. He simply said, "This time, you're not standing alone." The sentence stayed with Emily for a long time. There was another night when Daniel suddenly spoke, not looking at her. "Some days I wake up and still feel like I don't deserve anything." Emily didn't answer right away. She let a few seconds pass, then said slowly, "Me too." And they looked at each other, not like two people searching for a perfect half, but like two people who saw the fractures in one another and chose to stay anyway. Their growing affection needed no declaration. It lived in the moments Daniel lingered longer after his shift ended, in the way Emily no longer felt the need to be strong when sitting beside him. It showed in how they began to mention tiny plans, a weekend meal, a rare day off, without feeling it was too early or too late to do so. They weren't healed. Daniel still carried the wounds of his past. Emily still had days when she doubted herself. But they had stopped running. They chose to remain. And in that simple, deeply human choice, to be beside each other before becoming whole, something honest, quiet, yet profoundly deep began to grow. Not because they needed each other to be saved, but because for the first time in a very long time, they weren't afraid to keep living, now that someone else could see them. The project came to Emily Carter quietly, but with enough weight for her to understand that it wasn't merely a step forward, it was a test. The meeting took place on a weekday morning, a closed conference room, white lights overhead, thick stacks of documents lay out on the table. Her manager looked directly at her and said they wanted her to take the lead on a new project, one of high strategic importance, one that could determine the department's future direction. There was no flattery, no softening of the message, just a question that went straight to the point. Was she ready? Emily answered without hesitation, not because she wasn't afraid, but because this time, fear no longer kept her still. The days that followed moved at a fast, yet familiar pace. Long meetings, decisions that had to be made quickly but precisely, emails sent late into the evening. She was no longer standing on the outside watching. She stood at the center of the work table, taking responsibility, analyzing risks, listening, and connecting scattered pieces into a coherent whole. In the evenings when she returned to the gas station, Emily carried both excitement and uncertainty. She spread the documents out on the plastic table, talking and questioning at the same time, speaking as she revised unfinished thoughts. Daniel Reeves listened, without interrupting, without imposing, then asked exactly the right questions, pointing out bottlenecks she hadn't yet seen, perspectives only someone who had been through hundreds of negotiations could recognize. "This partner isn't just looking at the numbers," he said one night, his tone calm. "They're looking at long-term reliability. You need to show them who takes responsibility when things don't go according to plan." Emily took it in, not because he spoke eloquently, but because what he said was right. The more they worked together, the more Daniel realized a truth that left him both quiet and proud. Emily wasn't just capable, she was deeply invested in what she was building. She wasn't trying to win at any cost. She was trying to do things the right way, sustainably and responsibly. And that was what turned their exchanges from help into a true partnership on equal footing. The day the partner responded positively, Emily read the email 3 times to be sure she wasn't mistaken. The terms had been approved. The most difficult points had been cleared. She brought the news back to the gas station like a small flame carried inside her, telling Daniel in a voice she tried to keep calm, though her joy slipped through anyway. He smiled. Not the smile of someone who had predicted the outcome, but the genuine happiness of someone watching another person reach a place they truly deserved. "You did it," he said. Emily looked at him, her eyes bright, then suddenly said, "I want to take you out to celebrate." Nothing formal, no grand plan, just a late meal at their familiar small restaurant where they sat across from each other and let the tension dissolve into everyday conversation. Daniel was happy with her happiness, a joy that didn't need to be displayed, only understood. When Emily said thank you, she didn't say it out of courtesy. She reached for his hand, not hurried, not tentative. She held it firmly, as if anchoring a moment they both understood but hadn't yet named. Daniel closed his hand around hers, neither moving forward nor pulling away. And within that quiet grasp, something grew steadily, like a promise that didn't need words yet. The contract signing took place on a bright morning. Emily walked into the conference room fully focused, mentally prepared for the final meeting. But when the door opened, when the partners' delegation entered, the man leading them, Emily froze. Daniel Reeves. He stood there composed and precise, without flashy lights, without the need for lengthy introductions, simply a presence once very familiar to that world, and entirely unexpected to her. Emily signed her name with a steady hand. She didn't turn to look at him again. The signing concluded smoothly. Afterward, when the hallway was empty, they stood facing each other. Emily didn't demand answers. She didn't ask why he had stayed silent. She didn't ask why he was there. Daniel spoke first, his voice low and sincere. "Thank you, not just for the project." He paused, then continued, "I once thought I would never return to this place, but because of you, I remembered who I am when I choose to live honestly." Emily looked at him, and in her eyes there was no disappointment, no anger, only the understanding of two people who had walked through darkness and chosen to return in their own way. They didn't need to say much, because at this moment they were standing at the right time, where success was no longer the price paid for love, and love was no longer something that had to be sacrificed to survive. And in that calm, quiet silence, a new future gently began to unfold. A year had passed since that night at the gas station, and nothing in their lives exploded into the kind of dramatic transformation people like to romanticize. It moved forward steadily, patiently, like a structure built from the same right decision made again and again. The project Emily Carter led was a resounding success, not merely because its revenue exceeded expectations, but because of the way it was executed, smooth, responsible, enduring, becoming a new internal benchmark for the company. Emily was no longer the one who came back from a gap. She was the one who led. Her voice was clear, sharp, trusted. People didn't ask, "What do you think?" anymore. They came to her and said, "Give us a direction." Daniel Reeves stood beside her, not overshadowing, not claiming attention, just present, exactly where and when he chose to be. He returned to leadership quietly, and from there, he did something he had once forgotten how to do: put people before the pace of work. His company grew without anyone being harmed. His success was no longer compensation for old wounds. It was the natural result of a man who had finally learned when to pause. Throughout all the busy days, one thing didn't change. Every evening, they still made time for each other. No more old plastic chairs outside a gas station, but still late dinners, still hot coffee, still everyday stories, where work was something placed on the table as a part of life, not the entirety of who they were. On a quiet night, Daniel drove Emily back to where everything began. The old parking lot was still there. Yellow lights, familiar emptiness, and the silence that once held their fears. He stopped, turned to her, eyes steady and warm. "So, I never told you why I knocked that night," Daniel said slowly. Emily didn't hurry him. She had learned that some words need space before they can exist fully. "I'd passed by so many nights before," he continued, "and every time I kept walking. But that night, I saw you in the car, and I thought of something very clearly. I didn't want another woman to be hurt just because someone didn't show up." He paused, breathing deeply. "I knocked because I once wasn't there, and I didn't want to repeat that." Daniel got down on one knee. No flourish, no spectacle. A small, simple ring, chosen carefully, the way he chose to return to life. Slowly, surely, truthfully. "Emily," he said, voice strong and certain, "you taught me I don't have to disappear to pay for the past. If you'll let me, I want to stay for the rest of it. With you." Emily didn't need a single moment to think. She nodded, tears falling softly. Not from pain, but because she had finally arrived somewhere safe. A place where love didn't demand the sacrifice of self, where presence itself was the greatest promise. The wedding was small, only the closest people. Only real smiles, no stage, no elaborate ritual. Just two people who chose each other after choosing themselves first. They continued to succeed, each on their own path. Emily led bigger, deeper projects, always holding on to what she had learned from the hardest days. Kindness is a long-term strategy. Daniel led with a simple principle: no achievement is worth having if it leaves someone behind. But above all, they made time for their little family. Dinners on time, weekend trips, quiet pauses to listen. 5 years later, they had a son. Bright-eyed, curious, always smiling. When Daniel held him for the first time, his eyes shimmered. Not because he regretted the past, but because he finally knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. Emily looked at the two of them and realized a truth she had traveled a long way to reach. Life doesn't begin again with a miracle. It begins with someone choosing to stay. And sometimes all it takes is a knock at the right moment.